They thought of me as nothing more than a medic. A man with a red cross stitched onto his arm and a bag full of gauze, morphine, and bandages slung across his shoulders. In the eyes of my own unit, I was the one who ran when others fell, the one who patched torn flesh, stopped the bleeding, and whispered reassurances into ears that were already slipping away into silence. They didn't see me as a fighter, not really, not like the riflemen with their hardened glares or the machine gunners with the weight of war in their grips. To them, I was necessary but replaceable, a background presence in the theater of war. But to the enemy I was something else entirely. To them I was death itself, a shadow on the battlefield that took from them more than any bullet or mortar could. And it wasn't because I carried a rifle. It was because of what I refused to let die. War doesn't give you time to choose who you'll be. It takes the quiet boy, the gentle one who once dreamed of being a surgeon or a father, and it twists him into something he could never have imagined. I didn't come into the desert to kill. I came to save. My oath was to life. But out there, amidst the sand, the screaming, the smell of cordite and blood, I discovered a truth I could never unlearn. Sometimes saving lives was the most lethal weapon you could wield. Every time the enemy cut us down, every time they thought they had us broken, I crawled through mud and fire and dragged my brothers back to their feet. They thought they'd taken one of us out of the fight, but minutes later, I'd send that same soldier back, bandaged, furious, and hungry for revenge. To them, it must have seemed supernatural. Their bullets didn't stick. Their knives didn't end us. Their mortars didn't crush our will. And all of that was because of me. I remember the first time they realized what I was. We were pinned down in a valley, rocks exploding around us, the mountain spitting fire like the earth itself wanted us gone. I had 3 men screaming on the dirt, their blood pooling into one crimson river. I should have been dead with them, the snipers were hunting, the air was shredded with steel, but I kept moving. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't waver. I cut open a chest with my blade, forcing air back into collapsing lungs. I packed a wound so deep my entire forearm disappeared into the torn flesh. I jammed a needle into a vein while shrapnel skittered across my helmet. And one by one they lived. When the gunfire eased, when we pushed forward again, I caught sight of one of the enemy's bodies. His eyes were wide even in death, a look frozen in terror. He hadn't been afraid of the gunners. He had been afraid of me. That was the day I understood. My enemies had given me a name. They whispered it in their own tongue. Not because I killed them, but because I stole from them the only currency that mattered in war, the finality of their violence. Word spread fast after that. My own men started joking about it, calling me Doc Death, when they thought I couldn't hear. Some laughed. Some looked at me differently, like I carried something unholy in my kit. But I didn't care. I knew what I was. And so did the enemy. When they saw the red cross on my arm, their gunfire turned frenzied. They didn't fear the man with the heavy gun or the rockets. They feared me, the medic. They would target me first if they could. I'd hear them shouting through the smoke, their voices desperate, barking orders to cut me down before I reached the fallen. They knew that if I reached him, if I laid my hands on him, their kill was stolen away, their sacrifice meaningless. I was undoing their war with every life I saved. But war is not neat. It is not noble. And there were days when my role as death cut both ways. There were times I had to choose between 2 bleeding bodies, and the one I couldn't reach became a ghost that haunted me. There were times when the only way to save a soldier was to end another's chance at survival. I made those calls with a jaw clenched tight, with my heart tearing apart inside my chest. And yet, every time I crawled back to camp covered in blood that wasn't mine, the whispers grew. The enemy had started to mark my presence as a curse. They said battles turned when I arrived, that their bullets missed, that their wounds were wasted. They said I robbed them of victory itself. I didn't argue. Maybe they were right. I can still see the faces of the ones I brought back from the brink. Eyes rolling white, breath rattling in broken chests, hands clutching mine as if I were the last thread keeping them in this world. I saved them not with hope but with raw defiance, a refusal to let death claim them on enemy terms. And when they staggered back to the line, rifles in hand, something inside me hardened. I wasn't just a medic anymore. I was the pivot point of every battle. I was the reason we never truly lost. And if that made me death in their eyes, then so be it. They say legends are born in silence, but mine was forged in screams. Every time we rolled into a village, the people would scatter like frightened birds, their whispers chasing us down alleys and over rooftops. They weren't afraid of the armored vehicles or the gun barrels jutting out of every window. They were afraid of the man with the red cross stitched to his sleeve. They had learned that wherever I went, their dead refused to stay dead, their victories dissolved into smoke. It was strange, even for me, to feel that kind of weight pressing against my chest. I had never wanted glory, never asked to be seen as anything more than the medic. Yet as the months dragged on, I could feel the shift in every pair of eyes that lingered on me, friend and foe alike. To one side I was a savior. To the other I was a thief of souls. The Battle of Koresh Ridge burned the truth into stone. We were outnumbered 3-1, pinned by mortars that chewed the ground apart like some monstrous beast gnawing on bones. The first blast took out Corporal Yates, blowing him off his feet with his leg barely hanging on. I didn't think, I just ran. I dove into the crater, hands moving before my mind could catch up, tourniquet snapping tight, morphine stabbing into flesh. Bullets shredded the dirt around me, sparks flying off rocks, but I didn't stop. I dragged Yates back, blood soaking both of us, and when I looked up, I saw something I'd never forget. One of the enemy fighters staring down at me from across the ridge, frozen. His rifle was raised, but he wasn't shooting. His eyes weren't locked on Yates. They were locked on me. The moment stretched, fire and smoke roaring all around us, and then he broke, screaming something in his language before he emptied his entire magazine into the dirt. He wasn't aiming anymore, he was trying to erase me. That's when I knew. They didn't just fear me, they hated me with the kind of rage that makes men lose reason. That battle dragged into nightfall. I stitched men under the glow of tracers, my hands slick and numb, my knees grinding into mud. Every time someone fell, I was there, pulling, patching, shoving life back where death had already claimed its grip. We should have been crushed that night. We should have been wiped clean off the ridge. But by dawn we still held our line. We were bloodied, bruised, half-conscious, but we were alive. And when the enemy pulled back, retreating into the hills, the whispers began again. My men started calling me the one they can't kill, their voices hushed, almost reverent. They weren't looking at me like a medic anymore. They were looking at me like a weapon. The strange part was, I never fired my weapon unless I had to. My rifle stayed slung most of the time, the safety still on while I worked. But the enemy didn't see that. They saw how their kills slipped through their fingers, how the men they thought they'd broken rose again like specters. And maybe, in a way, I was killing them. Not with bullets, not with knives, but with despair. Because nothing cuts deeper into a soldier's heart than futility. If every wound you inflict is undone, if every victory evaporates, what's the point? That was the war I fought, the invisible one, where every bandage was a bullet, every life saved a strike against their will. But inside me the weight grew heavier. My brothers called me a hero, but in the dark, when the adrenaline faded and silence wrapped around me, I wondered what I had become. I could still smell the copper of blood in my nostrils, still hear the wet gasp of lungs filling with fluid, still feel the pulse fluttering beneath my fingertips only to fade away before I could save it. For every life I pulled back from the edge, there was another I couldn't reach, another I lost to the chaos. And they haunted me. They looked at me with hollow eyes in my dreams, asking why I saved him and not them. I carried them on my back, heavier than any pack or rifle. It was during one of those nights, sitting under the shattered roof of a burned-out home, that Captain Reyes sat beside me. He was a hard man, carved from stone, never one for words. But he looked at me then with something raw in his eyes. "You know what they call you?" he asked, his voice low, almost like he feared the shadows might overhear. I said nothing. He didn't wait. "They call you death." The word hung in the air, thick, suffocating. "Not because you kill. Because you deny them their kills. You're a curse to them." He let that settle before he added, "And you're the only reason we're still breathing." He stood, left me there with the echo of his words, and I realized the truth I'd been avoiding. I wasn't just part of this war anymore. I had become the war. By then I stopped caring what they called me. Medic. Angel. Curse. It didn't matter. What mattered was the next man screaming for help, the next pair of eyes begging me not to leave them, the next heartbeat I could keep going a few moments longer. That was my world now. That was my weapon. And I knew, deep in my bones, that as long as I drew breath, the enemy would never stop trying to silence me. But they couldn't. Not yet. Not while I still had lives left to steal back from their grip. The first time I realized the enemy had marked me specifically, it was in the middle of a routine patrol through the ruins of a village that had been fought over too many times to still have a name. The houses were skeletons, the streets littered with twisted metal and shattered glass. It should have been quiet. It should have been empty. But war never grants you should. We were moving cautiously, every rifle trained on the windows above, when the first shot cracked through the air. It didn't hit the point man. It didn't hit the radio man. It didn't even aim for the captain. It hit me. Or more precisely, it aimed for me. The round shattered the brick inches from my head, spraying dust and rock into my eyes. A sniper. And I knew right then he wasn't gunning for anyone else. He wanted the man with the red cross. Chaos erupted. My squad returned fire, shouting, scattering for cover. But I didn't dive for safety like instinct demanded. I couldn't. One of my men was already down, clutching at his side, blood pumping between his fingers. So while another round split the air above me, I slid across the dirt, my bag slamming against my ribs, and threw myself beside him. My hands moved blind through the haze of dust, sealing the wound, cutting fabric, forcing gauze into the torn flesh. All around me bullets snapped and ricocheted, but the sniper never let off. He kept his sights on me, dragging me into his crosshairs over and over, as though killing the medic was worth more than a dozen soldiers. That was the moment I understood fully, they weren't just fighting us anymore, they were hunting me. That hunt didn't stop when we escaped that village. From then on, every engagement, every ambush, I could feel the focus shift. Machine gun fire sprayed low where I crawled. RPGs slammed into cover right as I reached the wounded. Mortars seemed to walk across the battlefield in a straight line toward wherever I was kneeling. The enemy had made me their prize. And yet, the more they tried to erase me, the harder I clung to life, and the more furious my men became. They protected me with a kind of savage loyalty, not because they saw me as fragile, but because they knew I was the axis holding them together. If I went down, their hope went with me. And maybe that's what the enemy feared most. Not me. Not my hands. But what I meant to the men who refused to die because I refused to let them. One night, during a long firefight outside the ridgeline camp, they tried again. Mortar shells fell in perfect arcs, adjusting closer and closer until they bracketed my position exactly. They weren't shooting blind, they had eyes on me. A spotter. I dragged Private Dawson back behind a burnt-out truck, my shoulder screaming from the shrapnel that had already grazed me, and in the reflection of broken glass, I saw it. Across the field, in the half-light of burning brush, a man with binoculars fixed squarely on me. He wasn't watching the line, he wasn't scouting our defenses. He was watching me. The moment my gaze locked with his, he shouted something, and the next mortar slammed exactly where I had been crouched seconds before. They didn't want the camp. They didn't want the position. They wanted death. And they wanted him gone. But I wasn't gone. I wasn't finished. I kept dragging men from the fire, my blood mixing with theirs, until the night ended and silence fell. The camp reeked of smoke and scorched earth, but we were still alive. They hadn't gotten me. And in their failure, their legend of me only grew darker. Word filtered back through intercepted transmissions. The enemy commanders were calling me Al-Maut, the death that walks. They told their fighters to focus fire on me above all else, to erase the medic before anything else. They believed I cursed the battlefield, that wherever I walked, their dead would pile higher, their bullets would fail, their cause would rot. And though I never asked for it, I carried that curse like armor. My brothers noticed it too. I caught them watching me differently, sometimes with awe, sometimes with unease. They joked less, whispered more. It was as if even my own side couldn't decide whether I was still human or something else entirely. Captain Reyes never joked. He only nodded at me, his face carved with the same stone-cold certainty. He knew the truth. He knew I was the reason they could fight on. And so did I. The weight of it pressed deeper with every battle, every life I saved, every night I lay awake with the ghosts of those I couldn't. But still, when the dawn came, I strapped on my bag, I tied the red cross tighter, and I went back out there. Because whether they called me a medic or whether they called me death, the battlefield belonged to me. The hunt would never end. I accepted that. They could send 1,000 rifles, 100 mortars, a dozen snipers. They could scream my name across their radios, curse me in their prayers, paint my cross in their nightmares. But I would still be there, crawling through the dirt, dragging my brothers back into the fight. Death was not something I feared anymore. It was what I had become, not to myself but to them. And as long as the enemy saw me that way, I would use their fear as my weapon, as sharp as any blade, as final as any bullet. The day the war tried to break me came with no warning. We were moving through a valley of dust and jagged rock, a narrow passage where the mountains themselves seemed to close in like jaws. The enemy knew it well, they had been waiting for us there. The first explosion tore through the convoy with the kind of violence that rips sound from the world. The lead vehicle vanished in fire, the shockwave slamming us to the dirt. Before the ringing in my ears faded, the air erupted with gunfire from every side. It was an ambush, perfect and merciless. Men screamed. Metal shrieked. Bullets rained down from the cliffs above, and the valley became a tomb. I didn't think. I never did in those moments. I ran where the blood was thickest. Sergeant Malik lay sprawled near the burning vehicle, his chest torn open, his breath bubbling weakly through a hole where air shouldn't have been. I threw myself beside him, my kit already open, my hands deep inside the wound. Around me, tracers hissed like vipers, stones shattered, dust choked the air. My men shouted for me to fall back, but I didn't hear them. There was no sound but Malik's rattling lungs, no world but the torn flesh under my hands. I worked with fury, packing, sealing, forcing life into him. When his chest finally rose on its own, when his eyes blinked through the haze, I dragged him back, blood painting the ground like a signature. And in that instant I felt eyes on me again, the enemy watching from the cliffs. They weren't shooting at Malik. They weren't even trying to finish the convoy. Their rifles tracked me, always me. It was like fighting death itself. Every man I reached was pulled back from the abyss, and every time I did, their fire grew more frantic, more vicious. I moved like a phantom, crawling through burning wreckage, dragging bodies from open ground, sewing veins shut with my teeth clenched tight. Private O'Hara's leg was nearly gone. I tied it off, shoved morphine into his vein, and pushed him back into the arms of others. Corporal Singh's arm was torn to ribbons. I stapled it closed with my own hands shaking from exhaustion. And every time I rose from one broken soldier, another cry for help pierced the chaos. They were everywhere, falling faster than I could reach them, but I kept going, kept running, kept defying the storm of lead and fire. Hours passed like minutes. My bag grew lighter, my hands darker, caked with layers of blood that no amount of wiping could clean. My knees were raw from crawling. My ears roared with the thunder of explosions. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. If I stopped, death would win, not the name they gave me but the real thing, the shadow that followed us all. And yet, in the middle of that madness, a thought dug into me, sharp and poisonous. Maybe I wasn't just saving lives anymore. Maybe I was feeding the curse they whispered about. Because every man I pulled back to his feet went on to kill again. Every soldier who rose with my bandages and my morphine went on to fire into the cliffs, to paint the rocks with enemy blood. I wasn't undoing death, I was redirecting it. The realization cut deeper than any wound I carried. Was I really a medic anymore? Or had I become something else, something darker? My hands shook not from exhaustion but from the weight of it, the truth I didn't want to face. The enemy called me death, but what if they were right? What if every life I saved was just another bullet fired, another life taken on the other side? In my heart, I wanted to believe I was saving men for their families, for the lives they might still live. But on that battlefield, in the valley that reeked of fire and blood, there were no families, no futures, only killing. And I was the one who made it possible. By the time reinforcements broke through and we clawed our way out of the ambush, the valley was unrecognizable. Smoke cloaked the mountains, bodies littered the ground in tangled heaps, friend and foe alike. My men dragged themselves past me, half dead but alive. Always alive. They looked at me with something more than gratitude. Something closer to awe. They knew what I had done for them, what I had endured. But behind their eyes I saw another truth. They didn't just see me as a savior anymore. They saw me as the weapon the enemy had named me. They believed it now. And maybe I did too. That night, sitting in the wreckage of what was left of our camp, I stared at my hands under the dim glow of a lantern. They shook still, though the battle was over. They were cracked, blistered, raw from tearing open gauze and forcing stitches through torn flesh. They were hands meant to heal, hands that had once belonged to a boy who thought he'd be a doctor in a quiet city somewhere. But now they were drenched in war, forged into tools of something beyond medicine. Every scar, every callus, every vein throbbed with the truth. I had become the thing they said I was. Not just a medic. Not just a man. But death itself. And the terrifying part? I no longer knew if I wanted to fight it. The war had taken many things from me already. Sleep, peace, the quiet parts of myself I once thought unbreakable. But it had not yet taken someone I truly loved. That changed in the ruins of Baristan, a city shattered beyond recognition, where every corner smelled of smoke and rot, and the walls still trembled from the echoes of shellfire. We had been sent to clear what remained, to hold a checkpoint against an enemy that refused to stop crawling out of the rubble. It was supposed to be a small push, a routine sweep. But war laughs at the word routine. That was the day it reached for the one man I couldn't lose. His name was Alvarez. He wasn't just another soldier to me. He was my anchor, my brother in all but blood, the one who kept me from vanishing into the weight of what I carried. We had shared smokes under collapsing rooftops, shared stories of families waiting oceans away, shared silence when words felt too heavy to speak. He was the one who'd throw himself into fire to drag me out, the one who stood guard while I patched others, never letting me forget I was human. If anyone could remind me I wasn't just death, it was him. And that day death came for him. It happened in an instant. We were clearing the upper floor of a collapsed hotel when the blast tore through the stairwell. Dust and flames swallowed everything, the world folding into fire and thunder. When the smoke cleared, I heard his voice first, ragged, hoarse, a cry of pain that pierced deeper than any gunfire ever had. I scrambled through rubble, my lungs burning, my heart slamming in my chest, until I saw him. Alvarez lay twisted beneath broken beams, his legs mangled, blood pouring in sheets that stained the floor black. His face was pale, his eyes already glassy, but he still forced a grin when he saw me like he always did. "Doc," he rasped, his voice weak but steady, "thought you'd never get here." My hands moved on instinct but my soul trembled. Tourniquet, pressure, morphine, everything I had done 1,000 times before. But this was different. This was Alvarez. Every second I worked, I begged silently, pleaded with the universe, with whatever gods watched this cursed battlefield, not to take him from me. I could feel the life draining from him faster than I could fight. My bandages soaked through. My tools failed me. My hands, the hands they called death, shook for the first time in years. He knew it too. I saw it in his eyes, the acceptance, the quiet resignation. He grabbed my wrist, forcing me to stop, his blood slick on my skin. "Doc," he whispered, "you can't fix this one." I shook my head violently, refusing to hear it, refusing to let him go. "Don't you say that," I growled, my voice breaking. "Don't you dare." But his grip only tightened, his strength fading with every heartbeat. "You've done enough," he said, each word strained, trembling. "For all of us. Don't carry me too." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the world apart, to rip open the sky and demand that it give him back. But the battlefield doesn't care for bargains. His eyes fluttered, his chest shuddered, and then he was gone. Just like that. Gone. My brother. My anchor. My last tether to the man I once was. And for the first time since I'd set foot in that hell, I felt powerless. Truly powerless. The medic they called death had no power when it came to saving himself. Something inside me snapped that day. The enemy pressed harder, their gunfire rattling the walls, their voices echoing through the streets, but I didn't hear them. I only heard Alvarez's last breath, only felt the weight of his blood cooling on my hands. My men dragged me back when the building threatened to collapse, but I barely moved, barely spoke. I had saved hundreds, maybe thousands, but I couldn't save him. The legend the enemy cursed and feared had failed where it mattered most. And in that failure, something darker took root inside me. When dawn came and the fighting eased, I sat alone with his body until they took him away. I stared at his face, cold and still, and I made a promise that hollowed me out. If I could not save him, I would make every breath I stole back from the abyss count. For him. For all of them. If the enemy wanted death, then I would give it to them, not with bandages, not just with morphine, but with the fury they had birthed in me. I would become their nightmare not only because I saved lives, but because I refused to let Alvarez's death be for nothing. That night, when the others whispered that the enemy called me death, I didn't flinch. I didn't doubt. For the first time, I accepted it fully. Because in that moment, I no longer felt like just a medic. I felt like the embodiment of every soul they had tried to take from me. I felt like the storm that would never stop hunting them. They had killed Alvarez, but in doing so, they had unleashed something far worse. After Alvarez, something inside me changed forever. The man who once clung to the title of medic, who told himself he was there only to save, not to destroy, was gone. What rose in his place was something the war itself had carved out of me, something colder, sharper, relentless. For weeks I carried Alvarez's ghost beside me. Every time I stitched a wound, I saw his face. Every time I forced breath into a dying man's lungs, I heard his last words. At first it nearly broke me. But then, in the ruins of another nameless battlefield, as the enemy bore down on us with their endless fury, I realized the truth. The name they had given me wasn't a curse. It was a crown. And I was done denying it. The shift wasn't loud, wasn't sudden. It was a quiet acceptance that settled over me like ash. When the bullets screamed, I no longer flinched. When the mortars fell, I no longer ducked. I moved through fire with a calm that unsettled even my brothers, my kit clattering at my side, my eyes locked not on the sky or the enemy, but on the wounded who still called out. To them I was the same man, the same savior. But to the enemy I had become something else. They fired at me first, always first, but no matter how many times they tried, I rose again, dragging men from the jaws of death as if mocking their efforts. And when those men returned to the line, rifles steady, it wasn't just my hands that haunted the enemy, it was the storm I unleashed through others. The more they hunted me, the more I learned to use it. I turned their obsession into a weapon. If they poured their fire into me, then my brothers flanked them. If they set traps meant for my path, I drew them out and turned them against them. I became bait willingly because I knew their hatred blinded them. And in their blindness we cut them down. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was strategy. It was war. And I was no longer just a medic in it, I was its axis. But the transformation didn't stop on the battlefield. At night, in the shattered silence between raids, I could feel the weight of their whispers. My men no longer called me by name. They called me Doc, still sometimes, but more often I heard something else in their voices. Reverence, fear, dependence so heavy it suffocated. To them, I wasn't just the man with the bag. I was the promise that they would walk out alive. And for the first time I leaned into it. I let them believe it. Because if believing I was more than human gave them the courage to fight on, then so be it. Humanity was a luxury I could no longer afford. The enemy's fear grew alongside it. Intercepted chatter spoke of me like a specter. They claimed I walked unharmed through gunfire, that no bullet could find me, that the wounded I touched rose again like the dead refusing the grave. They told stories of seeing me in the smoke, my face smeared with blood, my eyes hollow, my hands glowing red under the firelight. They called me Almont, they called me the walker between worlds, and in their fear they faltered. I could see it in battle. The hesitation, the half-second pause before pulling a trigger, the glance over shoulders as if expecting me to appear behind them. That fear was worth more than any rifle, any tank, any shell. And so I gave it to them. I fed it. I made myself into their nightmare. I stopped washing the blood from my hands before battle. I let it dry there, let it crack across my skin, a mask of the dead I carried. I stopped speaking on the field except in sharp commands, my voice low, cold, unshakable. I walked through fire without breaking stride. I stood in the open when they aimed for me, daring them to try. Every act, every gesture, I twisted into theater, not for my brothers but for the eyes that watched from across the battlefield. If they wanted death, then death is what I would become. The strangest part was how natural it felt. As though I had been walking toward this from the very beginning, step by bloody step. All those nights I told myself I was just a medic, just a man with a bag of tools, were lies meant to keep me sane. But the truth had always been there, waiting. And now I embraced it. Alvarez's ghost no longer weighed me down, it walked beside me, a reminder of why I could not falter, why I had to wear the crown they had forced onto my head. For him, for all of them, I would never let the enemy rest. The line between healer and killer blurred until it no longer existed. The men I saved became weapons sharper than blades, and I was the hand that unleashed them. The enemy fell before us not only because of their wounds, but because of their fear. Fear of me, fear of the legend they themselves had forged in fire and blood. And I welcomed it. For the first time I stopped resisting. I was no longer just a medic. I was no longer just a man. I was death. And the battlefield was mine. They say every legend draws its own ending. I should have known the moment I accepted the crown of death that the enemy would come for me with everything they had. And when they did, it wasn't with subtlety. It was with fire, steel, and fury. Word spread fast through the lines that they had built an entire campaign around one purpose: to erase me. Not our battalion, not our foothold, not even the city we had bled to take. But me, the medic who would not die. They wanted to kill the myth as much as the man. And so they came at dawn, not with shadows but with a storm. The first shells landed as the horizon cracked with light, turning the sky into a burning wound. Artillery fell in sheets, pounding the ground until it shook beneath us like an angry god. Our trenches collapsed, men were thrown like rag dolls, and the earth itself seemed to scream. And above that roar came the voices of my men, calling, crying, bleeding. I knew this was no ordinary attack the second I heard the precision of it. They weren't wasting their fire across the line. Every shell landed where we were. Every strike sought me out as though they had mapped my very shadow. By the time I crawled from the dirt, my ears ringing, my lungs full of dust, the assault was already in motion. Waves of enemy soldiers poured over the ridges, their rifles blazing, their war cries sharp with hatred. And still their bullets hunted me. I saw it in the way their muzzles snapped toward wherever I ran, the way their fire cut paths only I walked. My men fired back desperately, but I was the storm's center, the eye they wanted to pierce. I moved as I always did, toward the screams of the wounded, my bag dragging behind me, my hands raw and steady. But this time was different. This time it wasn't just the ordinary chaos of war. It was personal. They weren't afraid of me anymore. They were determined. I felt it in every shot, every charge, every grenade lobbed closer to where I crawled. They were willing to drown themselves in blood if it meant dragging me down with them. The first soldier I reached was Lieutenant Harris, his arms severed, his eyes wide with shock. I bound the stump, forced morphine into him, dragged him back under fire that never stopped hounding me. But even as I saved him, more fell. Dozens more. The cries blurred together, a chorus of agony that tore me apart from the inside. I ran from body to body, stitching, sealing, dragging, but no matter how many I pulled back, it was never enough. For every man I saved, 2 more fell. For every soldier I pulled into the trench, another bled out where I couldn't reach. And still they kept coming. The enemy soldiers hurled themselves at our defenses, not for ground but for me. I saw it in their eyes as they closed in, rage, desperation, obsession. They didn't care if they lived. They only cared if I died. They screamed my name in their tongue, curses spat like venom. The medic. The death walker. They charged with bayonets glinting, some throwing themselves bodily onto the wire just to clear a path for others. My men fought like demons, but even they began to falter. Because how do you fight an army that has abandoned fear? Somewhere in that madness, doubt slithered into me. My hands slowed, my breath faltered. For the first time I asked myself, what if they were right? What if legends could die? What if all it took was one bullet finding its mark, one blade cutting deeper than I could stitch, one moment of hesitation? And worse, what if I failed my men in that moment? If I fell, how many would fall with me? The battlefield answered with blood. A mortar struck close, throwing me against the earth, my vision white with pain. My body screamed, my chest burned, but I forced myself up. My men's eyes found me, wide and terrified, searching for the one constant they had clung to. And in their eyes I saw it. If I stayed down even for a heartbeat, the line would break. Their courage wasn't in their rifles, their trenches, or their training. It was in me. If death faltered, so would they. So I rose. Through the ringing in my skull, through the agony in my bones, I rose. I stood in the open, dragging a bleeding man across my shoulders, blood pouring down my back. Bullets snapped past, grenades burst, but I walked as though untouched, my steps steady, my face unflinching. I wasn't just saving a man, I was showing the enemy, showing my men that death did not bow. That death did not bleed. Something shifted then. My men roared with renewed fury, hurling themselves back into the fight, their rifles spitting fire. The enemy, so sure they could break me, hesitated. Just for a moment, but it was enough. In that heartbeat of doubt, my brothers surged forward, cutting them down, driving them back. The storm didn't end, but it bent, it wavered. And I realized something vital. They could throw armies, fire, steel at me, but as long as I kept rising, as long as I kept walking through the fire, I wasn't just a man anymore. I was the story they feared, the myth they couldn't kill. When the sun set that day, the field was littered with bodies, the trenches carved deep with death. We had held. Barely, but we had held. My men slumped in exhaustion, some crying, some praying, some silent. And I sat alone, my hands trembling over the broken remains of my kit, my body shaking with the toll. I knew I wasn't invincible. I knew one day a bullet might find me, a blade might cut true. But as long as I drew breath, as long as I rose, I would carry the crown they had given me. And that terrified me more than any enemy ever could. Night fell heavy after the great assault, but the enemy was not finished with me. We all knew it. The air was thick with silence, the kind that comes not from peace, but from preparation. My men rested in broken trenches, too exhausted to even speak, their eyes hollow but alive. They had followed me through hell, and now they waited for the next descent. I sat alone at the edge of the line, staring into the black horizon. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from fatigue so deep it clawed at my bones. Yet I knew rest was a luxury denied to me. Because tomorrow they would come again. And this time they would not stop until either I was ashes or they were. The dawn that followed brought no subtlety. It began with silence, then the whistle of shells, then fire raining down like judgment itself. But unlike the day before, this was no ordinary offensive. This was final. They emptied everything into us, artillery, armor, waves of men. They poured their fury onto our line not to take ground, but to end the legend. To end me. Their voices carried across the battlefield, chants of my name twisted into curses, a collective roar that shook the earth. I felt it in my chest like a second heartbeat. And for the first time, I knew what it meant to truly be hunted. I moved as I always had, my bag slung across my shoulders, my hands steady despite the storm. Every step I took was a war against the weight dragging me down, exhaustion, wounds, despair, but still I went. To the wounded, to the dying, to the men.